Так, добрий день, ми розпочинаємо. Зараз 58 секунд. We will speak Ukrainian, so please, if you need translation, take the headphones. Не, спасибо. Можно. Okay.
Hello everyone, we are beginning the expert meeting, which is devoted to, in fact, half of the year, the 6 months of the full-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine. We do understand that tomorrow we'll have the Independence Day, tomorrow we'll have half of the year anniversary of the beginning of this phase of the war, the active one, and knowing and observing the behavior of citizen Putin and the Russians, we understand that they have some of the symbolic dates which they will try to do some. They're prone to some of the dates, and in fact everybody is in the security and defense sector. We get lots of requests what will happen tomorrow, how the war will develop further on, so we decided we'll speak about that, how we assess this half of the year, how we assess this phase of the war, what will happen tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, what's the prospects. So the participants of our today's expert meeting are Andrii Zahorodniuk, Minister of Defense of Ukraine in 2019-2020 and Chair of the Board of the Center for Defense Strategies. I am Alina Frolova. I'm Deputy Minister of Defense in 2019-2020, and now I am the Deputy Chair of the Board of the Center for Defense Strategies. We also have Mykola Beleskov, military expert and analyst of the National Institute for Strategic Studies. That is the only state think tank which exists in Ukraine, and Oleksiy Melnyk, Head of Foreign Policy and International Security Programs at Razumkov Center, one more Ukrainian think tank. So let us begin with a short assessment by each of the experts. What has taken place during this half of the year? How do you assess the current situation? And then we will speak about the future. Andrii? Hello everyone, my name is Andrii Zahorodniuk. I will be very short because we should either provide you with the long analysis or just to say several sentences and to answer your questions. So if I may, I would like to advertise myself a bit. I just had the column in Ukrainian Truth, Ukrainska Pravda edition. There are 7 or 8 pages of text answering the question what's the current situation and what we should do. So in a nutshell, lots of analysts, and I totally agree with them, they consider that we have the third stage, the third phase. If you remember the first one, it was the stage of the failed blitzkrieg, where in different operational directions, 150 plus 40,000 came to the territory of Ukraine. Then, when they understood that this blitzkrieg was failing, the Russians concentrated onto the one operational direction, that is the east. They established themselves in the south, and they were trying to do something in the Black Sea. So in fact it is considered, it's my subjective opinion, but it's not only mine, that this stage failed as well. That was interesting to observe 2 points. First, that we were able to implement the concept of the ban of access to the Black Sea. It was written already in the strategy of the development of the Navy of 2017, where it was written that until we have our own ships, first of all, we should close the issue of institutional awareness, and secondly, we will conduct and provide ourselves with the capacities to ban the access to the sea. So in simple words, that is to shoot whatever we want and to clean the sea from the presence of the adversary. Of course, there were people who were very skeptical about that. Nobody knew how Neptune is working. We didn't have any other missiles. It was more of a wish than an opportunity, but we still did it. We implemented it. We have modern missiles, and in fact, we implemented it. That's a very interesting and, I would say, well-known position that we have fully got rid, well, we haven't fully got rid. There are some of the threats left, but not how they used to be in March. There were different attacks, like the airborne operations, and they wanted to attack from different spots, and the possible use of the platforms for shellings and so on, which could be very close to our shore. So in fact, we pushed back the fleet of the Russian Federation to their shore. Of course, they will try to violate this is the ongoing process, but the fact that we managed to do that is just unique. Secondly, the point that they were instantly trying to impose some scenario, some kind of scenario, and they go on with this tendency. They are instantly permanently trying to impose some type of the war. In particular, in the east, the Russians finally understood that they should attack in one direction. They are not capable to work in multi-directions. And it can be explained. If you are interested, I can explain why. But the fact that they understood that, they concentrated on the east and imposed us their scenario. It looked like the following. They wanted to get to the border of Luhansk region, then Donetsk region, then to regroup and to go to the south, conquering everything up to the shore to cut us off the Black Sea. The total control over the Black Sea is one of the main strategic ideas of theirs, and for us it would be a geopolitical disaster. Ukraine managed to make them fail. We moved lots of their units, and now they don't have any opportunities to accomplish their missions either there or here. All of that is very vague. It is very unstable. We cannot say that everything is okay in any case, but as for now, the situation is the following. The failure of the imposed scenarios is still worth attention, because now they try to impose with another scenario. This is the war for exhaustion, because everybody is writing, if the quick war failed with a quick counter-offensive, either from this part or for the other part, then we have the war for exhaustion. This is the long war for years, because this is the war of resources, the war of attrition, and we are waiting whose forces will be out over the first. As Friedman wrote, the famous author whom I'm quoting all the time, that war of attrition is the war between two boxers who cannot win but still hit each other. And as there is no judge, they do that until one of them falls. And the analysts and the politicians and some of the observers and journalists are imposing this scenario as well. And if it takes place, then they will say, if it's for long, let us still be slower with the weaponry, with the armament. Let us consider that this marathon will be longer. I consider that it shouldn't be affordable for Ukraine. In any way, we shouldn't be directed into this direction, because it's not useful for us. It's useful for us to use the weakness of Russian Federation, because they are not capable to shape any serious escalation or serious formations. We need to take the armament which we asked and we still haven't got, and to impose our rules of the game. I think we will cope with that, but it's a very serious challenge, a substantial challenge, because one of our partners, not a single partner, doesn't have the strategy of our victory or the strategy of the failure of Russia. There is no vision. It can be shaped, but for that we need our own will. So in fact, that's what we are now at. What are the main challenges of ours? That's my subjective opinion, of course. Well, everything is subjective, of course. So, Mykola, do you agree with such an assessment? Because you're always observing the resources of Russian Federation. You understand what they began with, what they have now. How exhausted or not exhausted they are. Do they have a resource to get into this long run? It seems to me the Russians themselves do not know their own resource. because in other case, their policy would be better if they knew their resource. Only now they get to know, for instance, what's their real mobilizational resource of the industrial complex, which reserves they have, and what they're capable of when the West is really serious about the export control, for instance. But in any case, and I'm speaking about that rather often, and I need to repeat, because the issue of the people's perception is very important, there is really such an idea that everything is so there's a lot of resources there, especially when we speak about the ammunition to the classical artillery. But mostly I'm saying that the army which Russia had on the 24th of February 2022 will never exist, because that army, which was created for 12 years, was being created for 12 years, was done under favorable conditions, both financial and technological, because as the practice witnessed, we are not only taking obligations, but the export control was failed by our partners since 2014, and lots of components of the systems of Russian armament witness about that, which we gave for the analysis to our partners, and the reports of the British Analytical Center from the last week witnesses about that. So if this time the West is serious about the export control mode, then it will be hard for Russia to restore the armed forces which they had in the beginning of the war, because not a single country in the world has such a luxury to create on its own, to create modern weaponry on its own, especially Russia Federation, which is critically dependent on the import of the spare parts of the foreign producers as the practice witnesses. So they undoubtedly will never have the army which they used to have. But on the other hand, we shouldn't forget that really we are conducting the war with the state which had the biggest part of the legacy of the armament of the Soviet Union, which was trying to get ready to the World War III, the biggest part of the ammunition and the industrial and defense complex. Unfortunately, they have an opportunity for some time to create issues for Ukraine. But what do we mean when we say problems and issues? When the enemy loses, according to different assessments, 35 to 50% of their tanks in half a year, what they modernized and considered to be optimal during the last 10 to 12 years, is really demonstrative. We cannot even speak about any offensive when we look at the examples of World War II, because they would need armored vehicles and tanks. The same as about armored vehicles. When they lost approximately 4,000, that is 25 to 30% of what they had, this is a very serious loss. And this is also the argument why this mess will go on at the front line when the front line does not change, unfortunately, in any side, because unfortunately it does not change for us, but it does not change for them as well. They won't have this kind of an army, especially if the West will work with the export control, and it seems it will be working, because the latest notifications of the Wall Street Journal and the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Trade of the US are closely following these processes and flows. They are following the countries which could be used to avoid sanctions. If it is done, then for Russia it would be rather hard, but basing upon that part of the legacy of the Soviet Union, for some time Russia will be able to create some issues. On the other hand, not to take some of your time, what I always emphasize recently, that while Russia has spent a substantial part of their so-called high-precision weapons, those are thousands of missiles, without achieving serious outcomes. Yes, they created the fuel crisis, they are hitting against the infrastructure, the people are dying, but it did not make Ukraine to put up with that, and it did not let them to impose their will. Russia lost the substantial part of their high-precision weapons without the strategic effect. And how it was mentioned by Andrii, we're coming from the simple tactical systems to the serious systems. Yes, of course, we'd like more, but I would never say last year that we will have so many MLRLS and the distance missiles, Harpoon. It would be totally impossible. But now Russia has lost the substantial part of high-precision weapon, of Russian standard high-precision, but still without strategic effect, creating issues but without effect. We are vice versa. We are expanding our support. Objectively, it's not enough for us. We are constantly speaking about that. But in any case, this is an interesting situation, and it is really seen at the front line. Having the high-precision weapons for 100 kilometers, Russia does not have it. Though this is the main potential for the combatant warfare, we can see that in the dynamics of the front line, when we got ML142 and we have several missiles, it can lead to certain effect. Well, of course, we cannot take back all the territories, but still we stabilize the front line, and it wouldn't be possible without those high-precision systems. So Russia wouldn't have such the army, but the Soviet legacy will allow to create some issues for Ukraine. On the other hand, we have the situation when the arsenal of the high-precision weapons, especially of the depth where they have the main military objects connected with the military operations, is growing. Russia is still at war with the cannons of the Second World War. So, of course, we would like to have more positive dynamics of the front line and the offensive, the counter-offensive, but considering what we started with, which forecasts we saw, and comparing the dynamic, it's not that bad. Though, of course, it's obvious that the latest discussions in the West, whether Ukraine is capable of offensive or not in the south, and what's needed for that, well, of course, they make us remember that we need heavy armament, and we need much more of that.
Oleksiy, every day we learn positive news, like this morning that switchblades are going to be provided to us. But then another news from Germany, namely that they will not increase the supplies of weapons to Ukraine because they first need to be confident that they have combat-ready troops themselves. But experts in mass media keep claiming that Ukraine is overly optimistic in evaluating the situation at the front lines, that in the east the enemies keep pushing the Ukrainian troops kilometer here, kilometer there, and since there are no substantial changes happening at the front lines now, everybody is scrutinizing those kilometer-long retreats of the Ukrainian troops. So the big question is whether the Ukrainian troops are able to defend themselves and whether we'll have enough resources to keep fighting. Thank you, Alina, for asking this question. But what I suggest we start with is just come think about this. Tomorrow there will be 6 months since the beginning of this invasion. If only anyone would claim 6 months ago that we would be able to analyze the consequences of the first 6 months of this war, then we would be labeled overly optimistic, claiming that Ukraine will surrender in days, if not hours. But Ukraine perseveres, Ukraine stands strong, and what's important, Ukraine is ready to keep fighting for its independence, for the right to choose its future. The second thing I would like to share with you are my personal impressions, because I was in and around Kyiv at that time, and I remember how time transforms in your imagination, especially how long are the nights, especially in the first days of the invasion. On the one hand, time was so slow, but time flies, and so it's 6 months gone already. Being human, and I agree with Andrew here, we are all subjective about what we analyze. So that's why we are biased and subjective in our perception of what's going on around us. As a former military and employee of the Ministry of Defense myself, I've been to many conflict zones, and I was lucky enough not to be killed, and I was not killing anyone myself. So when you go to a conflict zone, you recognize the risks. Well, it's a peacekeeping mission, it's 4 months, and then you're back from the tour. But another thing is when the war comes to your home, then your perception of war is completely different. Why I'm sharing all this? Because when we look at the behavior of our partners, and back to your example of Germany, well, this war doesn't make them hurt like we're hurting. It's not their war, and we cannot convince them that they should treat it as their own war. It's up to them how they control the pace and the volume of military supplies to us. And that's why I believe it's an absurd statement that was made that we cannot share more weapons with Ukraine because there is threat coming from Russia. But who could Russia launch a large-scale military conflict with in Europe nowadays? Well, the answer is quite obvious, because if you look at the potential threat from China, well, most likely Russian tanks will not end up fighting there in the Eastern Front. That's why I urge our European partners, if you have an anti-tank missile that could destroy an enemy tank, or an air defense system that could destroy enemy jets, give those to Ukrainians, and we Ukrainians will do the job for you. That's the most expedient and efficient way of these weapons being used. Let me echo what's being said by other speakers, namely, what are the trends that we can state already? Russia lost the initiative, Ukraine has not yet regained the initiative, but what's important is that there is no monopoly for initiative. It's no longer only in the hands of the Russian aggressor. So we find ourselves in a so-called deadlock right now, and it's not quite clear where the situation might evolve into. After the first round was shot, this war became the war of intellects. But also there is a huge element of not being able to forecast what's going to happen next. But what we can observe already is that the Russians are no longer able to evolve their tactical small gains into operational or strategic benefits, and we all know the reasons for that. And the final point I would like to raise with you now is how we perceive the image of victory. If we look at the public opinion, and yesterday the Razumkov Center has published the recent poll results, which demonstrates that the Ukrainian society looks with conviction into the future. If I'm not mistaken, about 90% of people are confident that Ukraine will be victorious on this war. Of course, there are certain nuances how they perceive this victory, but the Russian society is not ready for painful compromises. And the Ukrainian authorities should take it into consideration, as well as our Western partners, especially when they come up with their own long-term visions or strategies how to conclude this war. So I believe that's the most important task for us, to share those messages with your help to our partners in the West. Well, if it's okay with you, I would like to ask you about the following. Well, in the last couple of weeks, there are lots of talks that the Russians are seeking peace talks. There are no direct signs for them, but Erdogan's visit and then some rumors and talks and information about Russians trying to arrange some sort of negotiations. So what should be the position of the Ukrainian authorities in such peace talks, even, well, if they are even possible? Well, there are three basic scenarios right now. The first is all of the Ukrainian territories, including the occupied territories of Donbass and Crimean Peninsula, being liberated. This is a wishful thinking scenario. Why I call it such? Because it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to carry it out right now. The second scenario is the Russian troops retreat to the positions that they held before February the 23rd. And the third scenario is something, is not attractive to Ukraine, but could be treated as a compromise for the Kremlin, of course, namely to start the negotiations having their troops at the positions where they stay right now, today. But like I said, the polls demonstrate that the Ukrainian authorities will have to take the position of the Ukrainian society into account. Like Mr. Danilov, the head of the National Security and Defense Council, said that even if Ukrainian society, even if the Ukrainian authorities want to stop this war, the war will go on because the society wants to finish it with victory. But the fact that Russians are seeking peace talks, of course, it's quite obvious, but unfortunately their positions stay the same. Ukraine needs to capitulate and they will ruin the whole of the country. Well, Andrew, my question to you is about the supplies of weapons. Lots of European economies claimed that they switched their economies to wartime regime. Well, a couple of weeks ago, something similar was said by Macron. Also, there were meetings with the producers of military equipment in the United States, and then those issues were discussed at Ramstein meetings. So how much weapons we still need and how long should we wait for it? Will it be manufactured for the upcoming year or so? Can I add first a couple of words about those peace talks? Look, how the Ukrainian people treated, that's critical importance. But at the same time, even taking this aside, there are no chances for peace talks, and all the Russians are looking forward to are not peace talks, but the delay in regrouping their efforts. And that's why Russia is doing everything they could, at least now, to make it a protracted war that might be frozen for a number of years. So what they want now is to reduce the level of involvement in this war of the populations of democratic countries, because the active citizens of those countries are supporting Ukraine in this war, and they help to shape the position of their politicians. And that's the reason why we finally started getting heavy weapons. And it's important for the enemy to put a stop to this public support, and then people would start complaining, oh, that's yet another Minsk arrangement and this war will last for years. I believe that's the scenario that they are dreaming about, because, like was correctly mentioned before, they are not able to reach their political goals through military means. Now, as to the military supplies to Ukraine, when they claim that we cannot share it with you because it will reduce combat readiness of our armed forces, well, for anyone of us military experts, it's crystal clear that it only means that they haven't yet passed the political decision. So since the political decision has not been passed, that's why they come up with such explanations like it would reduce our combat readiness. Well, why? Because whatever military equipment that is currently available in those countries are either in reserves or in the military units with clear plans how to use them. Like the Americans, the American armed forces, they even have the relevant terminology. The troops deployment plan, and they have clear plans what they would use the available excess articles for. They're not numerous, and they're used as operational reserves. So it's impossible to claim that they're giving us those extras. No, they always give it to us from the inventory of military units when they decide that in order to support your efforts in Ukraine, probably 100 HIMARS is too much for us. We might make do with 80. Well, of course, military commanders would say, no, we still need those 20 extras, but it's the politicians who make this decision. So I just want to say that there was no political decision just made just yet. Mykola, how about you? Well, speaking about the lessons learned in this war helped the West to recall and to remember what they forgot about already in the last 30 years, that war and military operations is all about continuous supplies of military equipment and weapons. Because we can see, even if it's a high precision military system, it runs out of ammunition or could be destroyed. Even in the States, they have ongoing discussions about potential war with China, but those discussions might generate some results looking forward. What I mean by this, even if they decide to crank up and increase the military production, well, we'll have to wait before they sign those contracts to manufacture those additional weapons. So in addition to javelins, now we're getting anti-tank systems, but not javelins, because they ran out of javelins, and the interim decision is to start giving us other anti-tank systems before they're able to produce more javelins. So I fully agree with Andrii here in terms of military planning considerations here. And Andrii was sharing an example of the United States, but after 1991, lots of European countries demilitarized themselves. So like Germans, it's not that they don't want to share weapons with us, they just cannot find any extras to do it. Finland, that will soon become the member of NATO, was the only one that had those excessive reserves, and they were able to share them with us. So it's not about that they don't want to, they just cannot. Switzerland has shared 1/3 of their Caesar weapons already, and or if we talk about counter-battery artillery systems, well, nobody knows how many of them should we have in our possession if we want to launch a successful counter-offensive. So these are political decisions that force us to identify what should be the legitimate military targets for us, provided that we are limited in both weapons and ammunition. So on the one hand, we might have a very clear commitment of our society to win this war. But unfortunately, in the West, the consensus is that Russia should not win this war against Ukraine. There is no consensus that Ukraine should prevail here. On top of this, there's an analysis of the American military intelligence that if Russia feels that it's being defeated in this war, then it raises the threat of escalation. And it's a unique case of Ukraine, the country that sustained such tremendous losses, but still is willing to fight until the victory. But unfortunately, the consensus in the collective West has not been formed. And finally, I agree with Andrew that any attempts to find out whether it's possible to launch peace talks, it's all about delaying the active phase of war, trying to regroup and then force some agreements on us. And even though Russia currently is devoid of any potential to meet political goals with military means, but they will still use the military fighting and as a tool of political pressure. So it was not the key factor before February the 24th. Since then, they decided that they could destroy Ukraine through by using military means. They failed, and now they try to use other political tools only because they want to win some more time for themselves. My last question to you before Q&A session is this. Today is 1 year's anniversary of Crimean platform being launched last year, and the second Crimean platform has been launched this morning, and lots of events happening at the front lines. Every morning starts by every ordinary Ukrainian checking the news whether there are any new explosions in Crimea. Well, we understand that the military plans have changed compared to what they had last year, but my first part of the question is, when can we liberate Crimea, and what would happen in terms of the security arrangements in the world after this war is over, something that would allow some sense of stability, because this is no longer a conventional war, so we probably could not foresee any upcoming conventional wars, especially with China. At the European continent, there are no other aggressors left, thanks God. But what needs to be done to prevent the next cycle, and what should be the proper configuration involving NATO, EU, and other defense unions?
Maybe you will correct me because of the latest data. Since last year, we had 43 countries which joined the Crimean platform. As far as I understand, several more will be announced today. In the morning, I saw that they are more than 60. There are lots of points for what we have to thank Vladimir Putin, because lots of efforts of the ministry and of the civil society and of the official authorities, everybody was very cautious whether we should stand for Crimea or maybe they should acknowledge it as part of Russia. So Vladimir Putin gave really clear arguments that the solution of the Crimean problem is integrated into the solution of the security and stability of the continent. Secondly, what's also important, and this is also so-called Putin's idea, even during the first talks, during the first negotiations which started in March, it was a very affordable and acceptable for Russia position So they wanted those talks to be at the level of the presidents. And then Ukraine was at the position of the non-military solution of this issue. Russia, with its own actions, pushed Ukraine for the war to come to the territory of the Crimean Peninsula. And this war was brought there by Vladimir Putin as well. This is not the guilt of Ukraine. This is what Putin and the Kremlin top management did. So as of today, if we look at the prospects, what will happen with the Crimea, I think that without the solution of the Crimean issue in the way how it should have been done, Crimea should be first demilitarized, then liberated from the Russian presence. Otherwise, it will be the delayed conflict. And if we try to look how the future security structure will be shaped, both of European and Euro-Atlantic continent, if we'd like this war, if we wouldn't like this war to be the legacy for our children and grandchildren, we should demilitarize the Russian threat. I'm not speaking about the split of Russia, which is also possible, but Russia shouldn't have its offensive potential. There should be created what Russia is dreaming about in its military doctrines, the buffer zone. But this buffer zone should be over approximately several hundred kilometers from the closest border with Ukraine and NATO from Russia. So I will add several points. I agree that the situation with the Crimea is the micro example when they tried to close the eyes onto this issue and they got the outcome. Because we remember what were the moods after 2014 and 15. The topic of the Crimea was not that easy to rise, but then since the 24th of February, they reminded about the negative consequences, what happens when you decide to turn a blind eye onto the aggression, because the occupied peninsula became the platform for the Russian offensive actions. All of that was a nice example to show how dangerous it was to turn a blind eye on what happened in 2014 and 15. There were lots of ideas, and they were speaking just behind the curtains. Let us not raise this topic. So really, we are living in a different reality, a new reality, where without demilitarization of Crimea, it would be impossible to have security of Ukraine and security of Europe. It's impossible to have the long-time settlement and regulation. The best formula for the long-term peace was said by the Ministry of Defense of the US. Russia should be as weak as it shouldn't pose a threat for Ukraine and Europe. But as we got to know after such ambitious announcements from the White House, there were some of the calls to Lloyd Austin, which reminded him, please hold up your horses. So we are coming back to that as well, to the consensus that Russia shouldn't prevail. Ukraine should prevail. We don't give you all the necessary weapons, but still, the deblockage of the shipping was done diplomatic. There was the military option, but no one gave us the necessary armament for that. So the cases in the Crimea and the Crimea explosions, the West is mentioning that they never gave weapons for that. There are some of the restricting factors. Still, after the 24th of February, nothing is impossible, not only negatively, but positively for Ukraine as well. In a nutshell, as for the Crimea, 2 points which I'd like to mention. First, it again proves that Ukraine has its future in its own hands, not in the hands of any other country. Everybody told us, forget about the Crimea. And we told so many times, meeting with different politicians, years by years, and everybody said, just stop about the Crimea permanently. But we said to them, yeah, but the Crimea is Ukrainian. They said, yes, sure, Ukrainian, and then a long pause. It used to be until the first Crimean platform took place last year. When we raised an issue in December 2020 about the Crimean platform, everybody told us, why? Crimea is not interesting for anybody. We said 2 points. It's for us to solve, not for you. And it turned out to be interesting for everybody. And secondly, if we lose the Crimea now and do nothing to take it back, there will be other regions on stake. So we are now on the edge of the 11th of September, whether the so-called referendum of annexation will take place. But the Russia is going along this way, it was trying at least, that if we announce some region ours, then the doctrine of the use of nuclear weapon covers it as well. So if Kherson region, as they consider, is Russian, then if we liberate Kherson region, theoretically they can use the nuclear weapon. It was the critical situation in the world, how the world responds. If the world responded just in an instant, we would be in a very hard situation. Someone tried. But thankfully, the politicians understood, with our help as well, that they shouldn't do like that. So what is really happening now in the Crimea is the demonstration that if the world considers it is not Russia, it is not Russia, whatever you say. But we will go on considering it not to be territory of Russia, but ours, Ukraine's. So whatever they conduct, annexations, referendums, anything else, we will consider that this territory is ours, and if it's necessary, we will liberate it in the military way. This is an important point. If we don't do that, it will go on, and there will not be end for that. So as for the prospects of the long-term guarantees of security or anything else, that's a long topic to discuss. So in a nutshell, the best option for Ukraine to become part of NATO, but we understand that it won't take place soon. So we all understand that we need to destroy the military potential of Russia. That is obvious. We agree with that. There are some debates how it should be done, but it's a long topic to discuss. But the main point is that now there are conversations about guarantees. Very respected people are working on that, interesting experts are working on that. They will definitely speak about that to the population, but it seems to me that the best guarantee is the potential of the armed forces. So we need to increase it until Russia understands that they don't stand a chance. Until this deterring factor does not exist, we will live with the new potential conflict during all our lives for a long time. Thank you. So let us move to the Q&A session. If there are any, if there are no questions, yes, please.
This is Sasaki of Kyoto News, Japanese news agency. I'd like to ask further about the Crimean situation. And there are many attacks, explosions there, and how far the Ukrainian army involved in this operation, and also how would be the reaction from Russian side you predict? Could it trigger a long-range attack beyond the combat zone, deeply to the heart of Ukraine? Thank you.
I think that this is the classical case when a very small charge of TNT leads not to strategic but to operational effect. Because just before those attacks, there was the announcement of Dmitry Medvedev, who intimidated and scared that any attack against Crimea will lead to Judgment Day for Ukraine. So obviously he hinted what was mentioned by Andrii, that according to the Russian nuclear doctrine, Russia owns the right to use nuclear weapon against the non-nuclear state. There were such threats mentioned before, But why do I say about the strategic effect? Because first, Russia was trying to lie traditionally and to show the attacks against Novofyodorovka as an incident, as something incidental. They were not ready to acknowledge, and they are not ready, thanks God, to those radical steps. The following attacks, well, at least Russia acknowledges that it is done by the Ukrainian part, but the Ukrainians are, in my opinion, conducting a very efficient policy of denial. Denying that, and it really hits the Russian authority even more, again, in the eyes of the Russian population. So I don't think that the Russians, in spite of the expectations, anxious expectations, can surprise us with anything. Because the last resort which they have is nuclear, chemical, biological weapons. But Andrii mentioned already, this is the long topic to discuss. Because the probability of the use of this weapon is not as high as it used to be. So I would say that they are hardly ready to provide any response equal by their understanding response to the hits which will be done against the military, I emphasize military objects on the territory of the Crimea. Oksana Polishuk, Ukrinform, could you please tell, as for the liberation of the south of Ukraine, they consider there is the option of the withdrawal of Russia because of the loss of resources and sense of combats. Is this scenario probable? That Russia will just leave on its own? Well, there are some chances for that, because we could see the same logics about Zmyny Island, when they hit the garrison and the communication which connected Zmyny with temporarily occupied Ukraine. The logics could be the same, because they don't have any other option. According to the classical actions of the World War II, we cannot act in any other way, but we need to act. We need to create issues for the adversary. So there are some chances. Of course, nobody will guarantee it, but on the other hand, we take into account all of the risks by the military superiors who understand that in case of the failure, the responsibility will be borne by the military commandment. Because when they succeed, there will be lots of owners of this victory. But if we fail, the failure will be the ownership of the commander-in-chief. So we could see some of the explosions and incidents which can also impact the capacity of combat. No one will guarantee, but it's very demonstrative how all of the Western media began to speak not about the support which Ukraine needs, but whether Ukraine is capable or not. But we need support. If we have the support, then we will be capable. And under these conditions, we do whatever is possible, and sometimes even a bit more. In my opinion, whether we are capable or not, we can just compare two maps, the beginning of the war and now. And then this response will become technical. We thank you. We didn't hear this question, but we hear it rather often from the Western media. How long, how much time do you need to liberate the territory? But they should ask what you need for that. And secondly, yes, the probability is there, and I think that these are the highest, the most probable chances, because every war is different from the previous one, because of the millions of circumstances, but still, assessing the situation, we assess only after it took place. Some of the colleagues of mine are sitting down and writing the reports. The professors and their assistants are involved, and then they acknowledge the war. This understanding and perception of the war is still ongoing now. But some of the points which the analysts already understand, that the tendency is that we are destroying their capabilities, and then the Russians face the dilemma. Either the offensive from us, which they lose because our capacities in that operational region are higher, and they cannot afford themselves that, because of some of the reasons, including subjective ones, and then they would say, let us withdraw and let us pretend that it should have been like that. Let's stick to some other plan. We can see such a tendency, and this tendency will still go on, because in this case we save our forces and means, and I would say that this is one of the ways to impact the flow of events. So yes, this is a very probable option. But looking at the questions whether this is the offensive or whether this is war of attrition, the answer should be, do we really have those options? Why does every new war bring something new? Maybe this one will bring something new as well. We'll see. Any other questions?
Thank you so much. I'm Susumu Sakamoto from the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. I have a question about prisoners of war. It's been already 3 months after the evacuation of the soldiers from Azovstal, and they're still in the Russian side. And could any of you suggest when could they be back on Ukrainian side? And what do you think Ukrainian government, as well as the international society, can do on this matter? Thank you.
No.
Well, let me respond to this first. A couple of days ago, we had a special event dedicated to Azov Regiment, specifically, and the trends with how they're being treated. You probably know that next week Russia plans to launch a mock trial against the Ukrainian defenders of Azovstal steelworks, and it has a couple of aspects here. It demonstrates inability of the international organizations to perform the function while they were established, existed for 50 years, received tremendous budgets, tried to prove their efficiency, but now, under critical circumstances, proved to be incapable of delivering. I'm talking about the United Nations here. And look, Russia is still the member of its Security Council, and UN gave us the guarantees that our prisoners of war will be treated humanely. Secondly, Russia speaks about some unclear organization, Azov, claiming that it's a terrorist organization. Azov Regiment is a military unit within the National Guards of Ukraine. So claiming that Azov is some terrorist organization, it's just a manipulation aimed at domestic audience, thus claiming to their own audience that Azov Regiment servicemen should not be treated as prisoners of war, instead as terrorists. Well, legally speaking, it's a null and void position. They are servicemen. They've received international guarantees that they will be treated as prisoners of war. And thirdly, this mock trial that the Russian occupiers are planning to carry out at the occupied territory, but for some reason using some Russian laws. And as a result, this whole story about taking those soldiers as prisoners of war first, but now trying to present them as terrorists. Well, it's yet another strategy of Russians to save time, to be able to regroup their forces. So Russia is not ready to exchange our soldiers, instead tries to come up with some mock trials, again, like I said, aimed at their own domestic audience. The same was true for Alenivka prison. It's all aimed at their own domestic audience, claiming that that's how they keep fighting Nazis and fascists allegedly, like they claim. So right now, unfortunately, nobody among the Ukrainian authorities can foresee what might happen with our prisoners of war. I fully agree with this. One thing that I would like to add here is that during September, October, probably even November, there is a chance of qualifying Russia as a terrorist state. Lots of talks in the US right now about this, but if that happens, and that's what makes Russia very nervous, is that lots of mechanisms of hitting hard on a terrorist state would be initiated. And, well, objectively speaking, Russia is a terrorist state because look what they're doing in respect of civilians and non-combatants. It's a clear definition of a terrorist state. But what they're trying to do now is to go through motions to distract from this trend of qualifying them as a terrorist state. And that's why they are blaming Ukraine in what they would be blamed soon enough. But like I said, they're doing this just to redirect the attention, making this mock trial against Azov regiment servicemen, trying to blame them in terrorism. And they're doing this to dilute the understanding of the West that it's them who are terrorists and who are involved in terrorist acts. Don't treat this as a joke, but still, the term country that sponsors terrorism, well, I agree with Andrew that Russia is a terrorist state, while the sponsors of terrorism are those countries who buy energy from Russia and who sell military goods or dual-use products to Russia. So it's high time to start asking questions to the governments of lots of countries. Do they want to be qualified as sponsors of terrorism? Is it even possible that the West will stop providing military assistance to Ukraine? What would be the conditions for that? You're talking about complete discontinuation? Well, it's impossible. They've already invested dozens of billions of dollars. Well, let's look at some exotic scenario. Donald Trump is reinstated in the White House, but at the end of the day, it's a bipartisan parliament there. There's Ramstein, the consensus of political circles in Europe, in Britain. So, yeah, an exotic make-believe scenario. And the only scenario, realistic scenario that I can see is that they will be just running out physically of the weapons, and that will cause less of the heavy weapons coming here, like self-propelled air defense howitzers. Well, yeah, they're running out of them, and that's why they start supplying fewer of them to us, but of course, it's not going to happen. When you reach the plateau of assistance, you don't reduce it, because it's all about credibility now. And let's not forget that Vladimir Putin keeps perpetrating crimes. And there is only one way to stop this: keep helping Ukraine. Before February the 24th, because of the hybrid nature of this warfare, you can hide behind such some pretenses. But even Jake Sullivan now says that Taiwan's success in countering China depends on how successful Ukraine is in the war against Russia. Well, the stakes are too high. This matter would not be made loose. also the collective West has a negative experience of being withdrawing their troops from Afghanistan. So the second defeat like this, both from the military standpoint and from the reputation standpoint, it's not something that the collective West is ready for. That's why people might still argue what would be the ultimate form of Ukraine becoming victorious, but of course there is no scenario at all of stopping military assistance. I would like to thank our experts for this discussion. I would like to once again congratulate everyone with the national holiday, the Day of the National Flag, and then with the upcoming Day of Independence. Glory to Ukraine.